Now, many businesses have borrowed heavily to see them through the crisis. How will they repay all those loans, particularly as the restrictions on business are now lasting much longer than anyone first thought? Some estimates by financial services firms suggest that something like £32 billion worth of debt will never be repaid. We spoke to the boss of one hospitality business, Martin Wollstonecroft. He runs Arc Inspirations, a bar chain with venues across the north of England.
Got 17 sites, Leeds, Harrogate, York, Manchester, up into Newcastle. We borrowed £4 million and we're currently trying to gain another £1 million CBIL loan. What's such a shame is that we had a very, very successful business before, and the money that we are borrowing is just really to stand still, and we'll be coming out of this in a far worse position with far greater debt, and it totally reduces our ability to grow our business for the future. And all this has been brought about through no fault of our own. To pay that amount of debt back, it might take us 6 years, and it's really going to hamper us for a long time. We'll have to make some very, very difficult decisions about our business going forward.
Well, I've been speaking to Stephen Welton. He's the Executive Chairman of the Business Growth Fund, BGF it calls itself now. It invests in small and medium-sized companies. I asked him how company finances were looking this year compared to last.
With some exceptions, a lot weaker. We're going through a recession that's devastating certain parts of the economy, like retail, hospitality and leisure. But for many other businesses, they are still operating at much lower levels. And that just means less profitability, less cash. And the way that they have survived is by taking on extra debt through the coronavirus business loan schemes. They were always designed to be temporary, to get over a short-term disruption. We're now looking at 12 months in this period, potentially longer. This is no longer temporary, it's permanent debt. And even with nominal interest rates, the principal still has to be paid back. And we are kidding ourselves if we think that more debt upon more debt is going to be sustainable. So for many businesses, this might be the final element of pushing them over the edge. And we've got to find a different solution, which is not short-term, is not temporary. And the only solution that makes any sense is to recapitalize these companies and to do it properly.
In those cases, are the companies now maxed out in the amount of debt they can bear?
Well, I think many companies are now exhausting available credit supplies, so banks will only be lending to them on the back of the government guarantees. So by definition, they are now over-indebted. If we want the banks to lend them more money, it will be with further government guarantees. And the problem are the SMEs, or the borrowers, who are going to face this unsustainable wall of debt that has got to be dealt with. It's either going to be written off at some point in time, or it's going to be rescheduled. Both of those will have a long-term drag on the economy. Far better to recognize the reality of overgeared businesses and to inject capital into them now so they can actually start to recover, because past recessions show very clearly it's coming out of recession when companies are short of working capital that they fall over. Companies coming out of the pandemic are already heavily over-indebted, and they won't have access to working capital at all in many cases.
Do you think the Treasury is minded to do anything like this? Because although there hasn't been any sort of official feedback, the murmurings that have come out of Treasury have been that actually this is a problem for the banks to sort out.
You've put your finger on what I think is the fundamental issue here. The banks have lent this money with the benefit of a government guarantee. And if these loans cannot be repaid, which is going to be the case for many businesses, I don't think the government is going to want to see the banks foreclosing on thousands of companies to call upon the guarantee. So like it or not, as the guarantor, the government and the Treasury are going to be a party to what happens. And it seems to me far more preferable to do this in an orderly way before the problems really get worse than to wait for this just to extend into zombie companies and insolvencies.
That was Stephen Welton of the Business Growth Fund. My markets guest this morning is Jane Sidham, Investment Director at Rathbone Investment Management. Jane, some commentary in the newspapers this morning about the likelihood, perhaps certainty, of a double-dip recession for the UK. What is a double-dip recession?
So it's a recession which we saw in the sort of second quarter of the year, so negative growth, followed by a period of recovery, but then a slip back into negative growth again, which I think is hardly surprising given the first lockdown sort of brought the economy to a halt. Then we opened up again, so there was quite a sharp bounce back, and obviously now we're closing down again. So it's it's that sort of yo-yo effect that we're seeing.
We talked briefly there about the amount of debt with Stephen Welton, the amount of debt that companies have been taking on. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, announced some more cash grants, particularly for the sectors most affected, retail, hospitality. Do you think there will be enough, and how much are businesses likely to get?
So my understanding is that there's up to £9,000 per property for the hospitality, retail and leisure sector. It's about 4.6 billion, I think, with the measures announced yesterday in the context of sort of total help of around 280 billion. So, a significant amount of money, but still relatively small overall. And of course, it's about time, as your previous guest said, it's about how much debt businesses have, how much they're struggling, whether they can make it through to the other side, and whether their cash flow is now so weak that they won't make it. I think it's very individual to each business, but it may not be enough in all cases.
Marks and Spencer's has often struggled with its clothing sales over the last, nearly forever. They have been problematic while the food side of the business has done well. It is apparently, is about to buy Jaeger, the British clothing brand, which is in administration at the moment. Do you think this would be a good move for M&S to have a new brand like Jaeger?
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting move, really. The most successful fashion retail businesses are those that are either have an incredibly efficient supply chain, or alternatively they are a platform for different brands. And actually, if this is a complete change for M&S and crossing over towards the idea of being a multi-brand retailer, it may be an interesting change, although it's worth making the point that Debenhams, of course, sold all sorts of brands, and it's not necessarily the answer in itself. But I think it's moving towards a more common structure for successful retailers.
Thank you very much. Jane Sydenham from Rathbone Investment Management.
And thank you, Dom. The time now is 29 minutes past 6. We can hear about the sport. Gary's here. Morning.
A very good morning to you. Tottenham are through to the League Cup final after a 2-0 win over Brentford. They'll play the winners of tonight's tie between Manchester United and Manchester City. Ian Dennis watched Spurs' victory.
A professional performance from Tottenham, who deservedly reached the final. Sissoko's header from 12 minutes set them on their way after a beautiful cross from Reguilon. Raya produced 2 more saves, the second an athletic and outstanding stop from Lucas Moura just before half-time. Aurier made a goal-saving block on Tony, who then had a goal disallowed after VAR before Son sealed it with an emphatic finish as he raced clear 20 minutes remaining. De Silva was then sent off 6 minutes from the end, again after VAR for a foul on Højbjerg. A 5th League Cup final for Jose Mourinho. He's won the previous 4, as Spurs now seek their first silverware since 2008.
There have been many tributes to Colin Bell, who's died at the age of 74. He played over 500 games for Manchester City. Here's our correspondent John Murray.
Undoubtedly one of Manchester City's greats, Colin Bell was one of the stars of the English game in the late 60s and early 70s. He spent 13 years at City, and under manager Joe Mercer, Colin Bell won all the domestic honours, including the league title in 1968, and a European trophy too, the Cup Winners' Cup 2 years later. For his tireless box-to-box midfield play, he was nicknamed Nijinsky after the great racehorse. Colin Bell won 48 caps for England and was part of the 1970 World Cup squad. But at Main Road, he was adored, also known as the King of the Kippax there, and one of the stands at City's current stadium is named after him.
John Murray on the life of Colin Bell, who's died at the age of 74. The Premier League say 40 players and club staff have tested positive for coronavirus over the past week. That's more than double the previous weekly high. The results come after there were a number of coronavirus breaches by players over Christmas. The Lions rugby tour to South Africa in June could be moved because of COVID. Plans are being considered to play the games in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Dublin. Finally, for the moment, here are the tips. They run at Wolverhampton at 5 minutes to 3, number 2, Tornado Queen, and then we're off to Kempton at 10 minutes past 5, number 4, Rainbow Sign.
Gary, thank you very much. Now, next Monday, Professor Brian Cox and Robin Ince are back on Radio 4.
The Infinite Monkey Cage returns for a 23rd series.
For a lot of people, the fact that we are a prime number series will be enough for them to switch on for all 6 episodes. That's it. That's all that Radio 4 listeners need. But other people want to know about content as well. We're going to be dealing with reality. Does it really exist? A lot of people are hoping we're going to come up with a no there. We've got one all about flies, which is frankly rather sordid. We're finishing with the history of rock. When did the history of rock begin? Is it about 4.6 billion years ago, or...?
No, it's nice, Chuck Berry.
There might have been a misunderstanding.
The Infinite Monkey Cage with Robin Ince and Professor Brian Cox starts next Monday afternoon at 4:30 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
The time now is 28 minutes to 7. You're listening to Today on BBC Radio 4 with Michelle Hussain and Martha Carney. Here's a summary of the news from Alan Smith.
England's third national coronavirus lockdown has legally come into force. Boris Johnson is to brief MPs on the new measures in the Commons before they vote on the restrictions later. Pupils in England will hear more about the cancellation of A-level and GCSE exams when the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, makes a common statement. He'll also give more details of support for pupils following the switch to remote learning. The Association of Colleges in England has criticised the government for leaving it to schools and colleges to decide whether vocational exams such as BTECs should go ahead this month. It said it was unsafe to hold them and they should be cancelled. The World Health Organization has said it would not recommend following the UK's decision to delay giving the second dose of the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine for 12 weeks. It said there was no data from trials to support this strategy. But the Chief Medical Officer for England, Professor Chris Whitty, said the government's approach would reduce deaths and pressure on the NHS. The election of 2 US senators to represent the state of Georgia remains too close to call. With about 95% of the votes counted, the Republican and Democratic candidates are separated by tiny margins. The Republicans need to keep just one of the seats to retain control of the upper chamber of Congress, enabling them to restrict the plans of the President-elect Joe Biden. Later today, a joint session of Congress will be held to certify Mr. Biden's victory. Police in Hong Kong have arrested dozens of pro-democracy politicians and activists in a major crackdown. They're accused of breaking a controversial new national security law imposed by Beijing. Around 700 people have been moved from their homes in a block of flats in Crawley in West Sussex because of a gas leak. Police say they're treating it as a major incident. And sales of new cars in the UK fell to their lowest level in nearly 30 years in 2020, according to figures from the industry's trade body. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders said it was the biggest one-year fall since World War II.
Alan, thank you very much. The time is now 26 minutes to 7. The rules of England's lockdown became law at midnight, but MPs will get a retrospective vote on the measures today. Jonathan Blake is our political correspondent. Jonathan, previously the Prime Minister did have some opposition when he brought in similar things from members of his own party. What will they want to know this time?
Well, getting Parliament's approval, as you say, Michelle, hasn't been easy for Boris Johnson throughout the pandemic. He's seen significant rebellions over the introduction of the lockdown in November and the tiered system, though this time Conservatives do seem resigned to the inevitable, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The new variant of the virus, of course, has sent cases rising so fast that there really isn't any other viable option, and I think that's accepted by the majority of MPs. And, of course, there is a way out in the shape of the vaccine or vaccines, which the government is administering. But senior Conservative backbenchers are making it clear that the pressure is firmly on the government to deliver on that aim of getting as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible, and specifically all those over 70 by mid-February.
We'll be talking to the Vaccine Minister, Nadine Zahawi, at 10 past 8. Also, what is going to happen about flights and people coming into the UK? There have been fewer flights, much less travel to the UK in the last month or so, but how will arrivals be dealt with?
Well, the Prime Minister said at his news conference yesterday, we'll be bringing in measures to ensure we test people coming into this country and prevent the virus from being readmitted. I'm told the government has not yet set out the details of that policy, but it won't be long before we get the exact requirements that are going to be put in place. All indications are, though, I think, that there will be some requirement for people coming into the UK to have a negative COVID test result within a certain time frame of when they arrive. And just to say, the other main concern that MPs have today is over the expiry expiry of the regulations which are being brought in. The date in there is the 31st of March, and that has raised some eyebrows because, of course, the Prime Minister has talked about a review in mid-February. I'm told this morning there's no lack of determination to make progress by then and to start lifting restrictions if possible, but the sunset clause seems to be remaining at the end of March.
Michael Gove also mentioned that 15th of February date. I guess that is a key date in terms of schools because it relates to half-term, but does it seem that little else will change at that moment in time, if indeed even schools change?
Well, certainly it's all up in the air at the moment, but certainly that is a key date, as you say, for February half-term, so it will be a sensible marker to allow pupils to return after that, a week after that, if possible. But that is what's being talked about the time frame, but as you point out there yesterday, Michael Gove's talking about early March, so I think there is little expectation that we'll see any significant relaxation of the rules at that first review point in mid-February.
Jonathan Blake, thank you. And the time now is 23 minutes to 7, and let's take a little more look in a little bit more detail at what's been going on with the infection spread. How fast is the virus spreading? What are the risks that will change too much for the vaccine to work, the so-called escape mutant? You can talk now to Palab Ghosh, our science correspondent. And Palab, what did you learn from the figures yesterday, particularly the ONS ones, which are very good, aren't they, at analysing the spread?
Well, it's darkest before the dawn, Martha. The number of daily cases are alarmingly high, with more than 50,000 cases each day for 7 consecutive days, reaching 60,000 yesterday. As you said, the Office for National Statistics estimated that 1 in 50 of us have the virus, 1 in 30 in London. And another chilling statistics, 3 in 10 hospital beds are occupied by COVID patients. But there are signs of hope. The number of new daily cases, though high, aren't increasing exponentially and possibly beginning to plateau. That means that the previous Tier 4 restrictions combined with the school holidays were having an effect, and hope is that the national lockdown will begin to bring infection rates under control and possibly down. But the real game changer will be the ramping up of the vaccine programme, where the government is aiming to immunise more than 13 million of the most vulnerable by that key date, the middle of February.
And how viable is that date, do you think?
Well, yesterday's Downing Street news conference, the government's chief medical advisor, Chris Whitty, described the target as realistic but not easy. This approach has been made feasible by the decision to adopt a single jab spaced apart 12 weeks rather than 3 or 4 weeks, as many other countries have chosen to do. Now, this means that in the first 3 months, double the number of people will be vaccinated than would have otherwise, and this will make a real difference to the pressure on the NHS, again, in that time frame.
And pressure too because of fears about the way that the virus is mutating.
Well, that's right. The new variant does seem to be spreading more quickly. It's hoped that the lockdown will have an effect, and the vaccine will also reduce the number of people becoming severely ill. And we have to wait and see whether it reduces transmission, because if that does, then that would make a huge difference.
Palab, many thanks.
It's 20 to 7. Let's have a look at today's papers and start with giving you a sense of the front pages, most of which take their cue from yesterday's Downing Street news conference involving the Prime Minister. 1 in 50 of us has COVID. That was one of the key bits of information, and it is picked up on the front page of The Sun as well as the Eye, the Daily Express, which also mentions that 1.3 million have got jabs. The Guardian, tough curves for months, as 1 in 50 now have the virus. The Daily Mirror, again, 1 in 50 infected and rising. The Daily Mail picks up on the suggestion about next winter from Professor Chris Whitty. COVID curbs may be back next winter. He said there might be some kind of restrictions that are still needed because winter is a time when infections tend to spread.
And on the front page of the Telegraph, they bill this is an exclusive. Pharmacies offer to give COVID jabs snubbed by ministers. And they're saying that senior industry leaders have revealed that high street pharmacies are desperate to roll out more than 1 million doses of the Oxford vaccine every week, but have been snubbed by the government. Simon Dukes, chief executive of the Pharmaceutical Negotiating Services Committee, questioned why the NHS was scrabbling around for vaccinators when his industry stood ready to help. He
said there are around 11,400 pharmacies across the country that already administer millions of flu jabs. We will be talking to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society a little bit later on.
Yes, and that theme about the Times, in the Times, I should say, about vaccines, millions more vaccines on the way, that is their lead angle this morning. But also on the front page, this question of how GCSE and A-level exams should be replaced. Retired teachers and Ofsted inspectors should check pupils' work to ensure that the right grades are given this summer. This is what Robert Halfon MP, the chairman of the Education Select Committee, has said. Independent assessors of school grades and moderation of those grades needs to be done by humans, not computers, a reference to last year's algorithm, which didn't go down well at all and resulted in a U-turn. Experts also tell the Times that grades awarded by teachers must be moderated to prevent inflation. There's also some pushback from some quarters about the cancellation of exams. Barnaby Lennon, who's chairman of the Independent Schools Council, says no system would be uniformly fair and exams should not have been cancelled. He's advocating short exam papers, assessed coursework and schools placing children in rank order.
And The Guardian, papers filled with New Year's style resolutions. Their headline, one of their stories inside the paper, record 500,000 people pledged to eat only vegan food in January. They're saying that the January is taken up by a rising number of people trying plant-based alternatives to meat. But it made me laugh because at the end of the article, they've got one of those follow-up articles you can click on, and it reads, "Pale and gelatinous, I tried vegan seafood, so you don't have to."
Right, the time is now 17 minutes to 7, and plans to tackle domestic abuse in England and Wales with a new law cleared another hurdle yesterday in Parliament. Many peers, however, called on ministers to strengthen it. Our correspondent Sean Curran was listening.
When MPs debated the plans to give greater protection to victims of domestic abuse, many of them shared harrowing accounts of violence and harm. Some talked about constituents, but others spoke as survivors or witnesses. When the Lords considered the domestic abuse bill for the first time, the Liberal Democrat Lord Paddock, a former senior police officer, talked from first-hand experience.
I was earning 8 times more than my abusive partner, but he was physically and psychologically stronger than me, enabling his coercive and controlling behaviour. I was a senior police officer at the time, but I did not tell anyone about the abuse for years, until it became physically dangerous. Even then, I did not report it to the police, despite being beaten up in the street.
He said half of male victims failed to tell anyone about their abuse. Ahead of this debate, the former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, the Conservative peer Lady Newlove, had called for non-fatal strangulation to be made a specific criminal offence. She told the Lords it would be an unforgivable missed opportunity if the bill didn't address the issue. Often when someone was grabbed by the throat, there were no visible marks, and so the attacks were treated less seriously than other acts of violence.
Yet this is a terrifying crime, my lords, and many victims testify that they genuinely felt as if their head was about to explode and that they were about to die during such a violent assault. Victims of non-fatal strangulation are 7 times more likely than other domestic abuse victims to go on to be killed.
The government has said it has no plans to change the law, but there was cross-party support for the idea of a new offence. A crossbench or independent peer, Lady Watkins, drew on her experience as a nurse.
Having worked in an accident and emergency unit, I have seen some of these victims. Yet their perpetrators are so skilled at this kind of abuse that they leave no physical marks, such as bruising, for others to witness and confirm that the events definitely took place.
At the start of the debate, the Home Office Minister, Lady Williams, said the bill had been universally welcomed. She said it was important to treat domestic abuse seriously and to help victims and survivors rebuild their lives.
Domestic abuse gives rise to some of the gravest and challenging of crimes, including coercive control, serious assaults, rape and murder.
For Labour, Lord Rosser welcomed the bill, but said it didn't do enough to protect migrant women who suffered abuse.
They are a particularly vulnerable group, whose abusers are able to use their immigration status, or rather lack of it, to prevent such victims from reporting or escaping from their abuse.
He said the system should not see these women as an immigration case first and victim second. Lady Burt, for the Liberal Democrats, also thought the bill needed what she called fine-tuning. She agreed that non-fatal strangulation should be a new offence, but that wasn't the only change she wanted to see.
Another new offence must be the threat to use intimate images as a result of control by shaming the victim into compliance. Using images is illegal, but the threat to use them as a means of abuse and control is not.
The Conservative former Culture Secretary, Lady Morgan, said threatening to share intimate images had been criminalised in Scotland, and now it was time for England and Wales to follow suit.
It is undoubtedly one way for a perpetrator of domestic abuse to exercise coercive control and to continue that abuse even after the perpetrator and the victim have separated.
A former Director General of Age Concern England, the crossbench peer Lady Greengross, raised another issue. She complained that the bill was silent on the abuse of older people.
But we know, my lords, that many older people are at risk of becoming victims of physical, financial, sexual or psychological abuse. Many others suffer abuse due to simple neglect.
There were no votes at this stage of proceedings, but peers will get the chance to propose changes to the legislation when they debate the bill in detail over the coming weeks.
That was Sean Curran reporting, and you can hear more from yesterday in Parliament on longwave and on digital radio at a different time at 8:45. The time now, though, is 12 minutes to 7, and our main headline. Boris Johnson is going to brief MPs on the stringent new coronavirus lockdown which legally came into force in England overnight.
BTEC exams and assessments scheduled to take place this month can now be cancelled. The Department for Education has had a change of heart and is allowing schools and colleges to decide individually how to proceed with the January exam series, which would involve more than 100,000 students. David Hughes is Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges. Good morning, Mr. Hughes.